Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for another Make and Tell Tuesday. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I did the coloring on the BotaniCuts Pine Bough die on this card. So I have all of my pieces already cut from the BotaniCuts Pine Bough die, and for assembling on the pine cones, if you're wondering about that, you can check out a previous video I posted where I showed how to assemble those, and today we're just going to be doing the coloring. So I'm going to show you how I did the coloring on this card. I did it with a combination of ink blending and colored pencils. And so we'll just go ahead and get started. I have already started adding a bit of color to some of the pine needle portions of the die cuts, and I'll show you how I did that. Those were done using ink blending. So if you've watched any of my previous videos, you might have noticed that I use a Cricut cutting mat in my Misty for stamping, and I trim those down and I keep the leftover parts of those mats, and I like to use those for a lot of times stenciling or ink blending, and so that's what I have here, and I'm going to be just sticking my die cuts onto this sticky mat, which works really nice because it keeps some of these finer points from moving around and shifting around a little bit on me while I'm adding the color with my little sponge daubers. And so I'm using a couple of different shades of Distress Oxide. I'm using Bundled Sage and Iced Spruce. And I want to keep the color really, really subtle. And so I'm actually not inking up my sponge any further than it already is. It's pretty saturated with ink, and so I'm just going to use it as is and keep that color really subtle. So this is the Bundled Sage, and then I'm going to also add a little of the Iced Spruce down kind of into the center of that branch where that color might be a little more intense on the needles. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. It's just a real subtle coloring, real simple and easy to do. And I'll finish off all the needle sections that way. So for the branch, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to just add the color with the ink blending. It's a really easy way to add color to these die cuts. It's a great way, even if you want to add more detailing and shading with your pencils, it's a great way, a quick and easy way to get a base of color down that you can then work further on, adding details and such with pencils. Which I'm going to do actually with this piece. I'm going to add just a little more shading along the edges of those branches. And you can actually use that die cut edge to your advantage when using colored pencils. I like to just kind of catch that tip of my colored pencil along that nice edge that you get on a die cut piece, and so that just automatically gives some nice shading. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, and we'll move on to the pine cones. So the pine cones were done with colored pencils alone. I didn't use any ink blending on those. I just used the colored pencils. These are polychroma colored pencils. The darker color is nougat and the lighter color is warm gray 2. And so I'm going to be using those two colors to add just some subtle shading. Now I do find that I like to assemble the pine cone first and then add my shading. It keeps me from doing extra work on the layers on the parts that are hidden and overlapping each other. It just goes a little bit quicker, and I think it's easier to envision where the darker parts of the shading should fall. And so I'm going to start off with this lighter colored pencil and we're going to start adding some shading, and we're going to focus the darker areas into where the pieces would be overlapped by a previous layer. And so I'm going to be adding that shading up in here where that previous layer overlaps. And like I said, I'm starting with the darker or the lighter color, excuse me, so that I can add that color and use quite a bit of pressure to get just some light shading in there. So like I said, I'm using quite a bit of pressure on my colored pencil because it's that nice light color. So I don't have to be too worried about adding too much color all at once because it's so light. So I am adding quite a bit of pressure and just adding all of that shading up into those points where the previous layer overlaps. Okay, so that's a good start, and then I'm going to take my darker colored pencil, this is the Nougat, and using a very, very light touch on this, because this is quite a bit darker, I'm going to add just a little more shading, a little more depth of color up into those points. And you just want to build up that color gradually. Like I said, I'm using a really light touch, and you just build it up gradually. And then you can also go back with the lighter color and kind of blend it out if you feel it needs a little more blending. Go back in with the lighter color and just soften that up. So I'm just going to continue in this same way all the way down the pine cone. I might also add some darker shading around the outer edges where the pinecone kind of curves around, and therefore these outer edges would be a little bit more in shadow, more than likely. Just to add that really kind of depth and roundness that a pinecone would have. Okay, so that is looking pretty good as far as the shading goes. I want to add just a little more detail, and so I'm going to be using the darker colored pencil, the same color that I used before, and making sure that you have a really nice sharpened tip on it. We're going to add some detail lines, and so I'm going to make sure that my pencil is nice and sharp, and I'm going to go in and add just some marks like that. So just kind of pull down from up in those tips. Just adds a little more texture and interest to those layers. So we have all of our pieces ready to go, and now we can go ahead and assemble our branch, and we're going to also glitter it up. So I'm going to be using some chunky glitter. This is American Crafts white chunky glitter, which I think is really, really pretty. I love the way it gives kind of an old-fashioned look to your projects, and so we're going to be using that. But you can of course use any glitter that you like. If you want a finer textured glitter, of course that works as well. And so we're going to go ahead and assemble this. I'm going to add some liquid glue just kind of down the center of that bottom layer of the pine needles for the larger branch, and then we'll add the smaller one over the top just like that, and we'll do the same with the smaller portion of the needles of the branch. That one goes underneath. You can of course assemble it however you'd like, but this is kind of how it was designed to be put together. You can snip these apart or use them, independently, however you'd like to use it on your project. So then I'm going to add a little more of this liquid glue just kind of down the center of these branches and also on the tops of my pine cones. And we'll go ahead and coat those with that glitter. So there you have these gorgeous layered white pine cones and this pretty glittered branch, and we can go ahead and use those on a project. Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial for adding color to our BotaniCuts Pine Bough dies, which are available at thegreetery.com.